The summer heat hung heavy over the small settlement of Miller's Creek, Texas. In 1847, dust swirled in tiny cyclones along the dirt road as Benjamin Walsh pulled his wagon to a halt outside the general store. The journey from Galveston had taken nearly 2 weeks, and his cargo furnishings and personal effects for the newly constructed Lindholm residence had survived mostly intact, despite the rutted trails. "Mr. Walsh, we'd nearly given up on you," called Jeremiah Lindholm, emerging from the store's shade. The Swedish immigrant had arrived in Texas 3 years prior, establishing a successful cattle operation that allowed him to build one of the settlement's first proper houses. His wife and 2 daughters had joined him only 6 months ago. Benjamin nodded respectfully. Shipment from Europe got delayed in Galveston. Storm damaged the harbor. He gestured to the tarp-covered items in his wagon. "Everything's here now, though, including that special item from Sweden you've been waiting on." Jeremiah's face brightened. "The portrait. Excellent." He turned to a young man loitering nearby. "Thomas, fetch Henrik and meet us at the house to unload." As they traveled the half-mile to the Lindholm property, Jeremiah spoke animatedly about the portrait. "Been in my wife's family for generations. Shows her grandmother and great-aunt as young women. The girls haven't seen it yet. It'll be quite a surprise." The Lindholm house stood out. Among the scattered dwellings of Miller's Creek, 2 stories of solid construction with a wide front porch. As the wagon approached, Elsa Lindholm and her daughters, Ingrid and Maya, aged 17 and 15, stepped onto the porch. When the crate containing the portrait was finally opened in the parlor, the family gathered around eagerly. Benjamin removed the protective wrappings with care, revealing a large oil painting in an ornate gilt frame. The portrait depicted 2 young women in formal 18th-century attire, seated side by side on a bench in a garden. Both had the same fair hair and blue eyes as the Lindholm girls, though their expressions were solemn, almost severe. "Your great-grandmother Astrid and her sister Linnea," Elsa explained to her daughters. "See how you resemble them?" Benjamin stepped back, allowing the family their moment. But as he glanced at the portrait from the doorway, something caught his eye, a peculiar quality to the sisters' eyes that seemed to follow him. He shook off the feeling and began discussing the placement of the remaining furniture with Jeremiah. Later, as Benjamin prepared to leave, young Maya tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Walsh," she whispered, her English still carrying a Swedish lilt. "Do the ladies in the picture seem strange to you?" Benjamin hesitated. "Paintings from that time often look a bit stiff to our eyes, Miss Maja." The girl shook her head. "Not that. When I look at their faces up close, they double quotes," she frowned, struggling for the words. "They change. Mama says I'm being silly, but when I lean in very close, their expressions, they're different. Like they're trying to speak." Benjamin patted her shoulder reassuringly. "Just tricks of the light and the painter's brush, I'm sure." But as he rode away from the Lindholm house, Benjamin couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. He'd transported countless items in his years as a freight driver, but never had he been so glad to be rid of a simple family portrait. What neither Benjamin nor the Lindholms could know was that in the coming weeks, the portrait would become the center of increasingly disturbing events, ones that would ultimately reveal why the sisters' images had been shipped across an ocean far from their native soil. A week after the portrait's arrival, Ingrid Lindholm sat in the parlor attempting to focus on her needlework. The heat of the Texas afternoon made the task difficult, but it wasn't the temperature alone that distracted her. From her chair she had a direct view of the portrait hanging on the opposite wall, and she couldn't shake the sensation that the painted women were watching her. "You're being as childish as Maja," she chided herself, deliberately turning her chair slightly to avoid facing the painting directly. The Lindholm home had quickly become known in Miller's Creek for its refinement, unusual in the frontier settlement. Jeremiah had insisted on bringing elements of their Swedish heritage into their Texas life, and Elsa had transformed the house into a haven of European sensibilities amid the rugged landscape. The portrait served as the centerpiece of their parlor, a symbol of family history and continuity. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Sheriff Davis and his wife joined them as guests. The conversation inevitably turned to the portrait when Mrs. Davis admired it. "Such a beautiful family heirloom," she commented. "The resemblance to your girls is remarkable, Mrs. Lindholm." Elsa nodded proudly. "The Lindstad women have always shared the same features. My grandmother Astrid, the one on the left, was known for her beauty in Uppsala." Sheriff Davis approached the portrait, studying it with interest. "Fine craftsmanship. You don't see work like this out here?" He leaned in closer, adjusting his spectacles. "Peculiar, though." "What's that, Sheriff?" Jeremiah asked. The sheriff frowned slightly. "When I look at it from here, the ladies seem to be looking straight ahead. But when I moved closer, he took another step toward the portrait, his face now just a foot from the canvas. Suddenly he jerked backward. "Samuel?" Mrs. Davis called, concerned. The sheriff composed himself quickly. "Nothing, just ... The eyes seemed to shift when viewed up close. An optical illusion, I suppose." Maja exchanged a meaningful glance with Ingrid across the table. Later that night, after their guests had departed, Ingrid found Maja standing before the portrait in her nightgown, a single candle in hand. "You shouldn't be down here alone," Ingrid scolded, though she kept her voice low to avoid waking their parents. "Look at their hands, Ingrid," Maya whispered. Look." Reluctantly, Ingrid joined her sister. In the flickering candlelight, the portrait seemed more alive somehow, the painted surface shifting with the dancing shadows. Astrid and Linnea sat primly side by side, hands folded in their laps. "I don't see anything unusual," Ingrid sighed. "Hold the candle closer." Ingrid took the candlestick and raised it toward the portrait. As the light illuminated the details of the painting, she saw what had captured Maja's attention. The sisters' hands, which appeared properly folded from a distance, revealed a different arrangement upon closer inspection. Their fingers were interlaced in an unusual pattern, forming what looked like symbols. "It's just how people posed back then," Ingrid said, though uncertainty colored her voice. "No," Maja insisted. "I've been watching. It changes. Yesterday their hands weren't like this. Paintings don't change, Maya. This one does. And there's more." Maja reached up, her fingers hovering just inches from the canvas. "If you touch it, don't." Ingrid grabbed her sister's wrist. "You'll damage it, and Father will be furious." A floorboard creaked overhead, and both girls froze. After a moment of silence, Ingrid tugged Maya away from the portrait. "Back to bed now. This is foolishness." As they climbed the stairs, neither girl looked back at the parlor. If they had noticed the subtle shift in the painted sisters' expressions, the slight curve of Linnea's lips that hadn't been there before, and the new intensity in Astrid's gaze as it followed their retreat. In their bedroom, Maya whispered to Ingrid before falling asleep, "They're trying to tell us something. Something happened to them, something bad." Ingrid dismissed her sister's imagination, but that night she dreamed of two young women in 18th century dress, walking through an endless garden, calling her name in voices that sounded eerily like her own and Maja's. Thomas Reed, the young man who had helped unload the Lindholm's shipment, worked as an assistant to Dr. Harrison, Miller's Creek's only physician. At 19, Thomas had aspirations beyond frontier medicine. He wanted to study at a proper university back east. His fascination with science and history made him one of the few people in the settlement who could read Swedish, having learned from his immigrant grandmother. On a humid morning in late July, Thomas arrived at the Lindholm house with medicines for Elsa's recurring headaches. He found Ingrid alone in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with unusual force. "Your mother's headaches still troubling her?" he asked, setting down his medical bag. Ingrid nodded, not looking up. "They've worsened since, double quotes," she hesitated. "Since the portrait arrived." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "The family portrait? How would that affect her health?" Ingrid finally met his gaze, and Thomas was struck by the dark circles under her eyes. "We're all sleeping poorly. Strange dreams. And Mother says she hears whispering at night, like women talking in Swedish, but not any dialect she recognizes. Perhaps it's the change in climate," Thomas suggested reasonably. "European constitutions often struggle with Texas summers." "Perhaps," Ingrid conceded, though she didn't sound convinced. Thomas hesitated, then asked, "May I see this portrait? I've heard it's quite remarkable." Ingrid led him to the parlor, where the painting dominated the room. Thomas approached it with scholarly interest, studying the composition and brushwork. "Excellent craftsmanship," he commented. "Mid-1700s, I'd guess." 1763, Ingrid confirmed, according to the inscription on the back. Thomas moved closer, examining the details. As his face neared the canvas, he experienced what others had reported, a subtle but undeniable shift in the painted women's expressions. He pulled back, blinking. "Curious optical effect," he murmured. "The artist must have employed some technique to create that illusion." "Is it an illusion?" Ingrid asked quietly. Before Thomas could respond, Jeremiah entered with an excited expression. "Thomas, good timing. The rest of our shipment from Sweden just arrived, books and documents I've been waiting for." In Jeremiah's study, crates of leather-bound volumes were being unpacked. "Family records," Jeremiah explained. "Journals, letters, ledgers, going back generations. I'm hoping to compile a proper family history." Thomas noticed Ingrid's sudden interest. "Father, are there any journals from great-grandmother Astrid or her sister?" "I believe so," Jeremiah replied, rifling through a stack of books. "Ah, here." He pulled out two small, leather-bound journals with faded dates on their spines, 1762 to 1764. "That evening." After helping Jeremiah organize the family archives, Thomas was invited to stay for dinner. The conversation remained light until Maya suddenly asked, "Father, how did great-grandmother Astrid and her sister die?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Elsa shot her daughter a disapproving look. "Maya, such talk at dinner." "It's a reasonable question," Jeremiah interrupted, though he seemed unsettled. "They died young, within months of each other in 1764. Some kind of fever, according to family records. Not uncommon in those days." "Both of them?" Thomas asked. "That seems unlucky. Life was precarious then," Jeremiah said with finality, clearly wishing to change the subject. Later, as Thomas prepared to leave, Ingrid approached him privately on the porch, pressing one of the journals into his hands. "This is Linnea's," she whispered. "I've tried reading it, but her handwriting is difficult, and some passages seem to be in code. With your knowledge of Swedish ... double quotes, you want me to translate it?" Thomas asked. Ingrid nodded urgently. "Something isn't right about their story. The portrait, the dreams, mother's headaches, they're connected." Thomas should have dismissed her concerns as feminine hysteria or frontier superstition. Yet the intensity in her eyes so similar to those in the portrait, gave him pause. "I'll see what I can decipher," he promised, tucking the journal into his coat. As he rode back to town in the gathering dusk, Thomas couldn't shake the image of the portrait from his mind. There was something in those painted faces that seemed to contain both warning and plea, as if the Lindholm sisters had been desperate to communicate. Something across the centuries, something they couldn't say directly. What Thomas couldn't know was that opening Linnea's journal would set in motion events that would finally reveal the truth. Not just about how the sisters died, but why their portrait had journeyed so far from home, carrying its terrible secret across the ocean. August brought relentless heat to Miller's Creek, turning the settlement into a furnace of dust and scorching wind. Inside the Lindholm home, however, an unnatural chill had begun to permeate certain rooms, most notably the parlor where the portrait hung. Elsa's headaches had worsened to the point that she remained confined to her bedroom most days, with curtains drawn against the light. Jeremiah divided his time between tending to his cattle business and caring for his increasingly frail wife, worry etching deeper lines into his weathered face. The responsibility of maintaining the household fell heavily on Ingrid's shoulders. She moved through her duties mechanically, exhaustion evident in her every movement. Only in the evening, when Thomas Reed visited to share his progress on translating Linnea's journal, did she show any real animation. "I've managed to decipher several entries from early 1763, Thomas told Ingrid as they sat on the back porch, away from the portrait's watchful gaze. Linnea was 22 when she wrote this, and much of it concerns typical matters, social engagements, household affairs. Nothing unusual?" Ingrid asked, disappointment evident in her voice. "Not at first," Thomas replied, opening the journal. "But in March, the entries change. Linnea mentions a painter who had come to create the sisters' portrait, a man named Eriksson. She describes him as having eyes that see too much and fingers that capture more than mere appearance." Ingrid leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "I'm not certain," Thomas admitted, "but she seems to have been uncomfortable with him." Later entries become increasingly disjointed. She writes about feeling watched even when alone, about dreams where she's trapped inside a garden that never ends. A shiver ran through Ingrid despite the evening heat. "That's similar to dreams Maja and I have been having." Thomas hesitated before continuing. "There's something else." In April 1763, Linnea writes about an argument between Astrid and their father. Apparently, Astrid had discovered something, some family secret that distressed her greatly. Linnea doesn't specify what it was, but after this entry she begins writing in a kind of code. "Can you break it?" "I'm trying." Some passages seem to alternate between Swedish and Latin, with certain words replaced by symbols. Thomas rubbed his tired eyes. "The clearest part is a repeated phrase. The portrait knows. The portrait sees." Inside the house, a door slammed suddenly, making them both jump. Maja appeared at the porch doorway, her face pale. "Ingrid, come quickly." "It's Mother." They found Elsa Lindholm sitting upright in bed, eyes wide and unfocused, speaking rapidly in Swedish. Jeremiah knelt beside her, trying to calm her. "She woke up screaming," he explained, distress evident in his voice. "She's been like this for several minutes. I can't make sense of what she's saying." Thomas approached cautiously. "Mrs. Lindholm? Can you hear me?" Elsa's gaze snapped to him, but there was no recognition in her eyes. She continued speaking, her voice taking on a different cadence, formal, archaic. "What is she saying?" Thomas asked Jeremiah. The older man shook his head helplessly. "It's not modern Swedish. Some older dialect I barely understand." Ingrid suddenly gasped. "That's not Mother's voice," she whispered. "It sounds like the voice from my dreams." Thomas listened carefully to Elsa's ramblings. catching fragments he recognized from his studies. She's talking about a betrayal, a secret kept hidden, something about blood and land. Abruptly, Elsa fell silent, her body going limp. Jeremiah caught her as she collapsed back onto the pillows, now unconscious. "Get Dr. Harrison," he ordered Thomas, who immediately rushed from the room. Later that night, after the doctor had examined Elsa and prescribed rest and laudanum, Thomas found Ingrid sitting alone on the stairs, her face tear-stained. "The doctor says it's brain fever," she said hollowly. From the heat and exhaustion, Thomas sat beside her. "Your mother will recover with proper care." "It's not brain fever," Ingrid insisted. "It's the portrait. It's doing something to us, Thomas. First the dreams, then mother's headaches, and now this possession." "Ingrid, you can't truly believe. Have you looked at it lately?" she interrupted. "Really looked?" Reluctantly, Thomas followed as Ingrid led him to the parlor. The portrait hung in its usual place, illuminated by a single oil lamp. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. The Lindholm sisters gazed out with their familiar, solemn expressions. "Look at their positions," Ingrid urged. Thomas studied the painting carefully. He had examined it several times over the past weeks, but now he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. The sisters, who had originally been depicted side by side on a garden bench, now appeared to be standing, their positions shifted slightly. "That's not possible," he breathed. "Keep watching," Ingrid whispered. As they stood motionless before the portrait, Thomas experienced a disorienting sensation, as if the room around them had fallen away, leaving only the painting expanding to fill his vision. The painted garden behind the sisters seemed to deepen, revealing paths and structures that hadn't been visible before. And the sisters themselves. Their lips weren't moving, but Thomas could hear voices, whispers in an archaic Swedish dialect, urgent and pleading. The truth lies beneath, the painter knew. The painter hid it in plain sight. Thomas stumbled backward, breaking the trance-like state. Ingrid steadied him, her eyes wide with vindication and fear. "Now do you believe me?" she asked. Thomas couldn't deny what he had experienced. "We need to examine the back of that portrait," he said firmly. Tonight, what they would discover hidden behind the canvas would finally begin to unravel the dark history of the Lindholm sisters. History of betrayal, murder, and a desperate attempt to communicate across time, seeking justice long denied. The Lindholm house creaked with familiar night sounds as Thomas and Ingrid waited in the darkness of the parlor. Midnight had come and gone. Jeremiah had finally retired after tending to his wife, and Maja had been asleep for hours, exhausted from the day's events. "We should be quick," Ingrid whispered, setting a lamp on the side table. "If father finds us tampering with the portrait, double quotes." Thomas nodded, approaching the painting with caution. In the lamplight, the sisters' faces seemed more alive than ever, their eyes following his movement across the room. "Help me lift it down," he said softly. Together they carefully removed the heavy portrait from its hook and placed it face down on the parlor table. The back of the canvas was covered with a layer of brown paper, yellowed with age. Along the edges, the paper had begun to peel away from the wooden stretcher. "Hand me my pocket knife," Thomas murmured. Working methodically, he began cutting along the deteriorated paper, revealing the back of the canvas beneath. Ingrid leaned closer, holding the lamp to provide better light. "There's something here," Thomas said, his voice tightening with excitement. He peeled back more of the protective paper, exposing handwriting that covered the entire back of the canvas, scramped, desperate words written in fading brown ink. "It looks like blood," Ingrid breathed, her free hand covering her mouth. Thomas didn't contradict her. The rusty brown substance had indeed once been blood, likely that of one of the Lindholm sisters. "It's a letter," he realized, squinting at the text. Written in the same code as parts of Linnea's journal, but more extensive. As Thomas began to decipher the hidden message, the air in the parlor seemed to grow colder. The lamp flame flickered despite the absence of any draft. "I, Linnea Lindstad, write this confession knowing my days are numbered," Thomas translated slowly. "My sister Astrid discovered the truth about our father's wealth, that it came not from legitimate business as we were told, but from the murder of our mother's brother and the theft of his inheritance." Ingrid gasped softly. "Family betrayal." Thomas continued reading. "When Astrid confronted him, our father arranged for us both to be silenced. The painter Eriksson was not merely an artist but a practitioner of dark arts. Father commissioned not just our portrait but our prison." The lamp flame dipped dangerously low, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. "Eriksson mixed our blood into his paints," Thomas read, his voice barely audible now. "He bound our spirits to the canvas through rituals performed as we posed. After the portrait was complete, we fell ill with an unexplainable malady. As I write this hidden message on the back of our prison, Astrid is already dead, and I feel my own life fading. Ingrid's hand trembled, causing the lamplight to dance erratically across the hidden text. I pray someone finds this message. Our souls cannot rest until the truth is known and justice is served. Our father's bloodline must acknowledge his crime and make atonement, or we shall remain trapped between worlds forever. As Thomas finished reading the final words, the lamp suddenly extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. A frigid wind seemed to swirl around them, though all windows remained closed. "Thomas?" Ingrid's voice quavered. Before he could respond, a loud thump came from upstairs, followed by Maya's terrified scream. They rushed upstairs to find Maya standing in the hallway outside her parents' bedroom, shaking violently. "What happened?" Ingrid demanded, grabbing her sister's shoulders. Mother Maja choked out, "She's gone. I saw her walking down the hall, but she wasn't alone. 2 women were with her, leading her by the hands." Thomas pushed past them into the Lindholms' bedroom. Jeremiah was still asleep, evidently exhausted beyond waking. But Elsa's side of the bed was empty, the covers thrown back. "Where did they go?" Thomas asked urgently. "Outside," Maya whispered, "toward the old well." The abandoned well, a relic from before the Lindholms had installed a proper pump, lay 100 yards behind the house, a dark stone circle covered with heavy wooden boards. Without waiting for lanterns, the 3 of them rushed out into the moonlit night. The Texas sky blazed with stars, illuminating the path just enough to see Elsa's white nightgown in the distance. She moved with an unnatural steadiness, flanked by 2 translucent figures that seemed to shimmer in and out of visibility. "Mother!" Ingrid called, running faster. As they approached the well, they could see that the covering boards had been removed. Elsa stood at the edge, swaying slightly, her eyes open but unseeing. "Mrs. Lindholm, step away from there," Thomas shouted. Elsa turned toward them, but her expression was not her own. Her face had taken on the severe, solemn look of the portrait sisters. "Justice must be served," she said in that same archaic dialect. "The truth must be known. The bloodline must atone." As Thomas lunged forward to grab her, Elsa stepped back, but not into the well. Instead, she collapsed onto the ground, unconscious once more. The shimmering figures that had flanked her seemed to dissipate into the night air. Later, after they had carried Elsa back to the house and roused Jeremiah, Thomas and Ingrid explained their discoveries. Jeremiah listened with growing horror, his face ashen in the lamplight. "My father never spoke of how the family fortune was built," he said finally, his voice hollow. "He only said it came from my grandfather's business acumen." "The portrait was sent away from Sweden after the sisters died," Thomas noted. "Probably to hide the evidence of what happened, and now it has found its way back to the family," Ingrid added, seeking acknowledgement and atonement. The first light of dawn was breaking as Jeremiah made his decision. "We must make this right," he declared, "for my wife's sake, for our family, and for the souls of my ancestors' victims." None of them realized that the path to atonement would be far more complex and dangerous than they imagined. For the Lindstad sisters had waited over 80 years for justice, and they would not be easily appeased. By the following evening, news of Elsa Lindholm's strange affliction had spread through Miller's Creek. Dr. Harrison had visited again, prescribing stronger medicines and recommending she be taken to Galveston for consultation with specialists if her condition didn't improve. Jeremiah was pursuing a different cure. After Thomas translated the remainder of Linnea's journal, revealing details of the binding ritual Erickson had used, Jeremiah became convinced that only by formally acknowledging his grandfather's crime and making appropriate atonement could his wife be freed from the sisters' influence. The ritual must be performed at midnight, Thomas explained to the assembled family in Jeremiah's study. According to Linnea's writings, that's when the veil between our world and theirs is thinnest. "This is madness," Henrik, the Lindholms foreman, protested. A practical man, he had reluctantly been included in their plans due to his loyalty to the family. "Ghosts and rituals, we should be focusing on getting Mrs. Lindholm proper medical care." "We've tried medicine," Jeremiah replied firmly. "It hasn't helped. If there's even a chance this might work, double quotes, Thomas spread out the pages where he'd transcribed the ritual requirements. "We need several items: a candle made from beeswax, water from the family well, soil from the garden, and most importantly, blood from a direct descendant of the man who committed the crime." Ingrid and Maya exchanged uneasy glances. "Just a few drops from your father," Thomas assured them. "The blood represents acknowledgement of guilt and willingness to atone." Henrik shook his head but said nothing more. The decision had been made. As midnight approached, they gathered in the parlor. The portrait had been returned to its place on the wall, but now seemed different somehow. The garden in the background appeared more extensive, the colors more vivid, and the sisters' expressions more intent. Elsa had been brought downstairs, propped up in an armchair near the portrait. Though conscious, she remained in a trance-like state, occasionally murmuring in that same archaic Swedish dialect. Thomas directed the preparations, placing a small table beneath the portrait. On it they arranged the beeswax candle, a bowl of water from the old well, and a small container of soil from what had once been the garden. "It's time," Thomas said as the grandfather clock in the hallway began to strike 12. Jeremiah stepped forward, rolling up his sleeve. Thomas used a sterilized needle to prick Jeremiah's finger, allowing several drops of blood to fall into a silver spoon, a family heirloom that had come from Sweden. Following Thomas's instructions, Jeremiah held the spoon over the candle flame. As his blood heated, he began to recite the words Thomas had translated from Linnea's journal. "I, Jeremiah Lindholm, acknowledge the crime of my grandfather, Nils Lindholm, who murdered his brother-in-law, Matthias Biberg, and stole his rightful inheritance. I acknowledge this sin that has stained our family for generations. I offer recognition, regret, and restitution." As Jeremiah spoke, the room grew noticeably colder. The candle flame stretched unnaturally tall, casting elongated shadows across the walls. Ingrid and Maja huddled together while Henrik watched with widening eyes, his skepticism giving way to unease. "By my blood and my word," Jeremiah continued, his voice steady despite the supernatural manifestations around them, "I pledge to make amends for this injustice. I will establish a fund in Matthias Biberg's name to help those in need. I will preserve and honor the memory of Astrid and Linnea Lindstad, whose lives were sacrificed to protect a terrible secret." The blood in the spoon began to bubble and smoke, though the flame beneath it remained steady. The candle's light reflected in the portrait, illuminating the sisters' faces with an almost lifelike glow. "I ask for mercy for my wife, who bears no guilt in this matter. I ask for peace for the spirits of the wronged. Let justice be acknowledged, let atonement begin, let the cycle of suffering end." As Jeremiah finished the ritual words, he tipped the heated blood into the bowl of well water. The moment the blood touched the water, several things happened simultaneously. The portrait on the wall seemed to ripple, as if its surface had become liquid. The candle flame shot upward, nearly touching the ceiling before extinguishing itself. A gust of wind swept through the room, though all windows remained closed. And Elsa Lindholm drew a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes clearing as she looked around in confusion. "Jeremiah," she said, her voice her own again. "What's happening? Why are we all in the parlor at night?" Jeremiah rushed to his wife's side, tears of relief streaming down his weathered face. "You're back," he whispered, embracing her. "Thank God, you're back." For a moment it seemed the ritual had succeeded completely, but as Thomas glanced at the portrait, he realized something had changed. Where once two sisters had been depicted, now only empty space remained, the background garden extending undisturbed across the entire canvas. "They're gone," he breathed. "Gone where?" Henrik demanded, staring at the now empty portrait with undisguised horror. The answer came in a scream from upstairs, where Maja had gone to fetch a blanket for her mother. Everyone froze, then rushed toward the staircase. They found Maja standing in the doorway of her bedroom, pointing wordlessly at her mirror. As they crowded behind her, they saw not their own reflections, but the faces of Astrid and Linnea Lindstad, watching them with solemn intensity. "The acknowledgement is only the beginning." The sisters spoke as one, their voices seeming to emanate from the very walls of the house. "True atonement requires more." Thomas stepped forward cautiously. "What more is required?" "Return us to our resting place," the sisters answered. "Our bones lie unmarked and unblessed in foreign soil. We must go home." With those words, the sisters' images faded from the mirror, quote, leaving only the shocked faces of the living reflected back at them. But everyone in the room understood the ritual of acknowledgement had succeeded in freeing Elsa. But the Lindstad sisters remained trapped between worlds, their spirits now unbound from the portrait but unable to find rest. The true challenge still lay ahead, discovering where the sisters' remains had been hidden, and returning them to their native Sweden for proper burial. Only then would the atonement be complete, and the haunting of the Lindholm family finally end. The following morning brought no respite from the supernatural events plaguing the Lindholm household. Though Elsa had returned to herself completely, with her headaches and trance-like episodes gone, other manifestations had begun to occur throughout the house. Objects moved without being touched. Whispers in Swedish echoed through empty rooms. Reflective surfaces, mirrors, windows, even the surface of water in a bowl occasionally revealed glimpses of the Lindstad sisters watching, waiting. Jeremiah had sent Henrik to town with a message for Sheriff Davis, requesting his presence along with that of Reverend Cooper. The situation had grown beyond their ability to handle alone. "They want their remains found," Thomas explained to the assembled group in the kitchen, where they had gathered for breakfast. None of them had slept much. "Based on the journal entries and what the spirits said, I believe Nils Lindholm, your grandfather, Mr. Lindholm, disposed of their bodies secretly after their deaths." "But where?" Jeremiah asked, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "And how would we ever find remains buried 80 years ago?" "The old well," Maya suggested quietly. "They led Mother there." A heavy silence fell over the room as they considered the implication. If the sisters' bodies had been thrown down the abandoned well. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their grim contemplation. Sheriff Davis arrived with Reverend Cooper, both men looking concerned and skeptical in equal measure. After Jeremiah explained the situation, omitting some of the more fantastical elements for fear of being dismissed entirely, Sheriff Davis frowned thoughtfully. "So you're saying you've uncovered evidence that your grandfather may have been involved in a murder back in Sweden, and you believe the victims might have been disposed of on this property when he immigrated?" Jeremiah nodded. "We have reason to think they might be in or near the old well behind the house." "That's a serious accusation against your own kin," Sheriff Davis observed. "What kind of evidence are we talking about?" Thomas stepped forward with Linnea's journal and the transcription of the message from the back of the portrait. "Historical documents that recently arrived from Sweden," he explained. "They contain detailed accounts of the events." Reverend Cooper, a thin man with serious eyes, examined the pages with interest. Though he couldn't read Swedish, the earnestness with which Thomas and the Lindholms presented their case clearly troubled him. "Even if this is true," the Reverend said cautiously, "disturbing a grave, an unmarked one, is no small matter. There must be proper procedures, prayers." "Of course," Jeremiah agreed quickly. "That's precisely why we asked you to come, Reverend. We want to do this properly, with respect and in accordance with both legal and spiritual considerations." Sheriff Davis scratched his beard. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in examining the old well. If there's nothing there, no harm done. And if there is ... double quotes, he left the implication hanging in the air. By mid-morning, a small group had gathered at the abandoned well. Henrik had brought 2 of the ranch hands to assist with the heavy labor, and Thomas had fetched Dr. Harrison, whose medical expertise might prove necessary. The wooden covering had been completely removed, revealing the dark circle of the well shaft descending into the earth. The stone walls disappeared into blackness about 20 feet down. "It hasn't been used in years," Jeremiah explained. "When we built the house, we installed a proper pump system closer to the kitchen." Sheriff Davis peered down into the darkness. "Doesn't look like there's much water left in there." "Mostly silted up, I'd guess." "We'll need to send someone down," Henrik stated pragmatically, "with ropes and a proper lamp." Thomas volunteered immediately. "I'm the lightest one here, and I know what we're looking for." They rigged a sturdy harness from leather straps and rope, testing it carefully before allowing Thomas to be lowered into the well. He carried a storm lantern and a small shovel, his face set with determination despite his obvious apprehension. "If you feel anything shift or give way, call out immediately and we'll pull you up," Sheriff Davis instructed as the men took positions on the rope. Thomas nodded, then stepped into the harness. With a deep breath, he allowed himself to be lowered into the darkness. The descent seemed interminable. The stone walls of the well passed by slowly, damp and slick with moss. The air grew colder and heavier with moisture and decay. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the circle of sky above him, fighting against encroaching claustrophobia. When his feet finally touched solid ground, he found himself standing on a spongy mass of silt and debris. The bottom of the well was narrower than he had expected, giving him barely enough room to turn around. "I'm down," he called up, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "It's mostly silted up, just as the sheriff thought. Several feet of sediment, I'd guess." He raised his lantern, examining the stone walls that surrounded him. Decades of mineral deposits had created strange patterns on the stones, almost like faces peering out from the walls. Thomas shuddered, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. Using his small shovel, he began to probe the soft ground beneath his feet. The sediment gave way easily, revealing darker soil beneath. He worked methodically, moving in a small circle, digging test holes. "Finding anything?" Jeremiah's voice echoed down from above. "Not yet," Thomas called back. "Just mud," and his shovel struck something solid with a dull thud. Thomas froze, then carefully began clearing away the surrounding silt. As more of the object was revealed, his breath caught in his throat. It was a bone long and unmistakably human. "I've found something," he shouted upward, his voice tight with tension. Working with painstaking care, Thomas excavated more of the area around his discovery. Within minutes, he had exposed enough to confirm his suspicion. Human remains, partially preserved by the cool, airless environment at the bottom of the well. "There are remains down here," he called. "At least one body, possibly more beneath it, above." A flurry of activity ensued as Dr. Harrison prepared his equipment and Sheriff Davis organized the retrieval effort. Reverend Cooper began a solemn prayer, his voice carrying down to where Thomas continued his grim work. As Thomas cleared more soil away, he uncovered something nestled among the bones, a small silver locket, tarnished black with age but still intact. With trembling fingers he picked it up, using his handkerchief to wipe away the worst of the grime. The locket opened with surprising ease, revealing a miniature portrait within a tiny, exquisitely detailed painting of two young women with fair hair and solemn expressions. The Lindholm sisters, unmistakably. "They're here," Thomas whispered, more to himself than to those above. Both of them. A sudden chill enveloped him, far colder than the natural temperature of the well. His lantern flickered violently, nearly going out. In that moment of near darkness, Thomas felt rather than saw presences around him, two feminine forms standing impossibly in the narrow space of the well shaft. "We have found you," he whispered in Swedish. "We will take you home." The lantern steadied, and Thomas was alone again, or as alone as one could be in a well with the remains of murdered women. He secured the locket in his pocket and signaled to be pulled up. The recovery operation took the remainder of the day and into the evening. Dr. Harrison supervised the careful extraction of the remains, which were indeed those of two young women. The bones showed no obvious signs of violence, supporting the story that the sisters had been poisoned rather than killed by physical means. "These have been down there a very long time," the doctor confirmed as the remains were laid out on clean sheets in the Lindholm's barn away from the house. "Consistent with the time frame you mentioned." Sheriff Davis looked troubled. "This is now officially a matter for the authorities, even if the crime occurred decades ago in another country. I'll need to send telegrams to both Austin and the Swedish consulate in Galveston." "Of course," Jeremiah agreed. "We want everything done properly." Thomas approached with the silver locket, presenting it to Jeremiah. "This was found with them. I believe it confirms their identities." Jeremiah examined the tiny portrait within, his face solemn. "This matches the large portrait exactly. These are my great-aunts." That night, with the remains secured in the barn under Sheriff Davis's watch, the Lindholm family gathered in the parlor. The atmosphere in the house had changed. The oppressive presence had lifted somewhat, but there remained a sense of expectancy, as if the final act of the drama was yet to come. Finding them was only the first step, Thomas reminded them, consulting Linnea's journal again. They want to be returned to Sweden, to their family plot in Uppsala. "That's a journey of thousands of miles," Henrik pointed out. "Across an ocean. How are we to manage such a thing?" Jeremiah's expression was resolute. "If that's what must be done to right this wrong, then that's what we'll do. I'll make arrangements immediately to transport the remains to Galveston, and from there by ship to Sweden." As he spoke these words, the empty portrait on the wall seemed to shimmer slightly in the lamplight. Though the painted images of the sisters were gone, their presence remained, waiting for the promise of homecoming to be fulfilled. None of them realized that the journey to return the Lindholm sisters to their resting place would face one final, terrible obstacle, one that would test their courage and resolve to the breaking point. 2 weeks passed before all the necessary arrangements could be made. Sheriff Davis, after consulting with authorities in Austin, had officially documented the discovery of the remains. The Swedish consulate in Galveston had been notified and had provided the necessary documentation for transporting the sisters back to their homeland. Jeremiah had commissioned 2 proper coffins of cedar wood lined with silk. The remains had been carefully cleaned, wrapped in linen, and placed within these coffins. Along with Linnea's journal and the silver locket, the empty portrait, now merely showing a garden scene without its subjects, had been crated for transport as well. Thomas had insisted it must accompany the remains, as the sisters' spirits seemed to maintain some connection to it. "I'll be accompanying you to Galveston," Thomas informed Jeremiah as they supervised the loading of the wagon that would transport the coffins. "I've arranged leave from Dr. Harrison." Jeremiah nodded gratefully. "Your help has been invaluable, Thomas. But the sea voyage to Sweden that I must undertake alone." "Not alone," Ingrid corrected, stepping forward. "I'm coming with you, Father." Jeremiah looked startled. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous, too difficult a journey for a young woman." "I've already discussed it with Mother," Ingrid said firmly. "She agrees that I should go. The sisters have formed a connection with me, perhaps because we share the same blood, perhaps because of our resemblance. Either way, I believe my presence will help ensure their peaceful passage." Thomas watched this exchange with mixed emotions. Over the past weeks, his admiration for Ingrid had deepened into something more significant, though propriety had prevented him from expressing such feelings during a time of family crisis. "She's right," he said finally. "The sisters have shown a particular affinity for Ingrid. Her presence may be crucial to completing the atonement properly." Jeremiah looked from Thomas to his daughter, then sighed in resignation. "Very well, but Maya stays here with your mother." Maja, who had been listening nearby, made no protest. The ordeal had taken its toll on the younger girl, who now seemed relieved to be excluded from the final journey. The trip to Galveston took 3 days of hard travel. Though no further supernatural events occurred during the journey, an unnatural stillness surrounded their party. Birds fell silent as they passed. Animals kept their distance. It was as if nature itself recognized the passage of something not quite of this world. In Galveston, they secured passage on a merchant vessel, the Atlantic Star, bound first for New Orleans and then across the ocean to Liverpool, from where they would make their way to Sweden. The captain, a weathered man named Hollister, had been reluctant at first to transport human remains, but was persuaded by a combination of proper documentation and generous payment. "We sail with the evening tide," Captain Hollister informed them, as the coffins were carefully loaded into the ship's hold. "Make sure you're aboard by 4 o'clock. Thomas accompanied them to the harbor, helping with the final arrangements. As the time for departure drew near, he found himself alone with Ingrid on the dock, watching the sailors prepare the ship. "I wish I were going with you," he admitted, breaking the uncomfortable silence between them. Ingrid turned to him, her blue eyes so similar to those of the women in the portrait reflecting the afternoon sun. "I wish that too. You've become—" She hesitated, then continued softly, "important to us. To me." Thomas took a breath, gathering his courage. "When you return, I hope we might have the opportunity to become better acquainted, under happier circumstances." A smile touched Ingrid's lips for the first time in weeks. "I would like that very much." Their farewell was interrupted by Jeremiah calling for Ingrid to board. With a last, lingering look, she turned and walked up the gangplank, her back straight and determined. Thomas remained on the dock until the Atlantic Star had disappeared beyond the harbor, carrying its unusual cargo and his unspoken hopes for the future. The first 3 days of the ocean voyage passed uneventfully. The Atlantic Star proved to be a sturdy vessel, cutting efficiently through the Gulf waters toward New Orleans. Jeremiah and Ingrid kept largely to themselves, staying in their small but comfortable cabin when not taking meals with the captain. On the 4th day, as they approached the Mississippi Delta, the weather began to change. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the sea, which had been relatively calm, grew increasingly choppy. "Storm coming," Captain Hollister informed them grimly over dinner. "Might delay our arrival in New Orleans by a day or two." That night, as the ship began to pitch and roll with the growing waves, Ingrid found herself unable to sleep. The small porthole in their cabin showed only blackness, punctuated occasionally by lightning flashes. The wind howled around the ship, and rain lashed against the wooden hull with increasing fury. Jeremiah had finally fallen into a restless sleep after hours of pacing. Ingrid rose quietly from her bunk, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Some instinct, some pull she couldn't explain, drew her from the cabin toward the hold where the coffins had been secured. The ship's corridor swayed beneath her feet as she made her way carefully down the narrow stairs. No sailors were visible. All hands were likely needed on deck to manage the ship through the storm. Using a small lantern she had brought from the cabin, Ingrid navigated through the cargo hold until she reached the section where the coffins lay, strapped firmly to prevent shifting. Beside them stood the crated portrait, similarly secured. As Ingrid approached, her lantern illuminated the crate, and she gasped. Through a gap in the wooden slats, she could see that the canvas was no longer empty. The figures of Astrid and Linnea had reappeared, though their expressions now seemed troubled, fearful. "What's wrong?" Ingrid whispered, addressing the portrait directly for the first time. A violent wave struck the ship, nearly knocking Ingrid off her feet. Her lantern clattered to the floor, but miraculously remained lit. As she steadied herself against a support beam, the air around her grew unnaturally cold. 2 translucent figures materialized before her, the Lindholm Sisters, appearing just as they had in the portrait, though their forms seemed to waver and flicker with the ship's movement. "Danger comes," they spoke as one, their voices barely audible above the storm. "He follows us still." "Who?" Ingrid asked, her heart pounding. "Who follows you?" "The painter, Erickson. His spirit bound to ours through blood and art." The spectral forms grew more distinct as they spoke. "He would keep us imprisoned. He comes now through the storm." Another massive wave struck the ship, and this time Ingrid heard something more than the natural sounds of the tempest. A deep, resonant voice chanting words in a language she didn't recognize, carried somehow within the howling wind. "What can I do?" she asked the spirits, fighting against her growing terror. "The locket," they answered. "Open it. Place it upon the portrait." Ingrid moved quickly to the first coffin, which she knew contained the personal effects found with the remains. The securing straps made it difficult to open, but she managed to loosen them enough to raise the lid slightly. Reaching inside, her fingers found the small silk pouch containing the silver locket. The ship lurched violently, throwing her against the wall. Outside, the storm reached a new intensity, with lightning striking so close that the thunder shook the entire vessel. The spectral forms of the sisters began to fade, their features distorting as if being pulled apart. "Hurry," they pleaded, their voices fading. "He tries to reclaim us." With trembling hands, Ingrid pried open the crate containing the portrait. The painted faces of the sisters now showed expressions of open terror, their hands reaching out as if trying to escape the canvas. Ingrid opened the locket, revealing the miniature portrait within. Following the spirit's instructions, she pressed the open locket against the larger painting, directly over the hearts of the painted figures. The moment the locket touched the canvas, a blinding flash of light filled the hold, not from lightning, but from the portrait itself. The ship seemed to freeze momentarily, hanging suspended between the massive waves. In that frozen moment, Ingrid heard an inhuman scream of rage and frustration, a sound that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the supernatural manifestation ceased. The ship plunged back into normal motion, though the storm outside seemed to be rapidly diminishing. The portrait had changed again. The sisters were still visible, but now they appeared peaceful, their poses relaxed, their expressions serene. The background had shifted as well, showing not the formal garden of the original painting, but a sunlit churchyard with a stone building visible in the distance. Uppsala, Ingrid whispered, recognizing the scene from her father's descriptions of the family's ancestral home. The locket had somehow fused with the canvas, becoming part of the painting itself, a small silver oval positioned between the two sisters, connecting them. When Jeremiah found Ingrid in the hold hours later, the storm had passed completely. Sunlight streamed through the small portholes and the ship sailed on calm seas once more. "What happened?" he asked, taking in the scene. The partially open coffin, the altered portrait, his daughter sitting exhausted but triumphant on the floor. "They're free," Ingrid said simply. "Truly free now." The painter Exon tried to reclaim them during the storm but failed. "They've broken his hold over them completely." Jeremiah didn't ask how she knew this or what exactly had transpired. Some things, he had learned, were better accepted than questioned. The remainder of the voyage passed without incident. In New Orleans, they transferred to a larger vessel for the Atlantic crossing. 6 weeks later, they arrived in Sweden, carrying the remains of the Lindholm sisters back to the land of their birth. The final ceremony in the Uppsala churchyard was small but dignified. A local pastor, distant cousin to the Lindholms, officiated as the sisters were laid to rest in the family plot. The portrait, now showing the sisters at peace in the very churchyard where they were being buried, was donated to the church where it would be displayed and the true story preserved. As Ingrid placed wildflowers on the fresh graves, she felt a sense of completion, of a circle finally closed after nearly a century. "It's finished," she said to her father as they turned to leave the churchyard. "They're at rest now." Jeremiah nodded, placing an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Yes, and it's time for us to go home as well." Neither of them noticed the two faint figures standing by the church door, watching them with grateful smiles, figures that faded into the golden Swedish sunlight as the Lindholms walked away. The voyage back to America seemed remarkably swift and ordinary compared to their outbound journey. No storms troubled their passage, no supernatural presences made themselves known. It was as if nature itself acknowledged that balance had been restored, justice served, the dead properly laid to rest. Jeremiah and Ingrid spent the long days at sea planning for their future. The experience had changed them both profoundly. Jeremiah spoke of establishing the charitable fund he had promised in his ritual of acknowledgement, a foundation to help orphan children in both Texas and Sweden, named in honor of the Lindholm sisters. Ingrid found herself contemplating a different future than she had imagined before. The ordeal had awakened in her an interest in history and the preservation of truth, no matter how long buried. "Perhaps I might assist Thomas in his studies," she mused aloud one evening as they stood at the ship's rail, watching the sun set over the endless Atlantic. "He speaks of attending university in the East eventually. I could learn much from such an environment." Jeremiah regarded his daughter thoughtfully. He had noticed the growing connection between Ingrid and the young medical assistant, had observed how Thomas's scholarly mind complemented Ingrid's intuitive intelligence. "There are women's colleges now," he said carefully. "If that is truly your ambition, your mother and I would not stand in your way." Ingrid's smile was answer enough. When they finally returned to Miller's Creek in late October, the settlement was preparing for winter. Though Texas winters were mild compared to Sweden's, there was still a sense of battening down, of community drawing together against the coming cold. Elsa and Maja met them at the general store where the stagecoach had deposited them. The reunion was emotional, even more so when they reached the Lindholm house and found it transformed. The oppressive atmosphere that had pervaded the home was completely gone. The parlor, where the portrait had hung, had been redecorated with bright fabrics and fresh flowers. No trace remained of the supernatural events that had occurred there. "It feels like a different place," Ingrid remarked as she explored the familiar rooms. "It is," Elsa confirmed. "After you left, Maja and I had the house blessed by Reverend Cooper. Then we opened all the windows for 3 days, letting fresh air and sunlight into every corner. Maja, who had seemed so frightened and fragile during the haunting, now appeared stronger, more mature. "I told Mother we should make this a happy home," she explained. The sisters wouldn't want their suffering to leave a permanent shadow here in the days that followed. Life gradually returned to normal for the Lindholm family, though normal now held a deeper meaning, a greater appreciation for the peace they had earned. Thomas Reed visited the day after their return, ostensibly to check on their health after the long journey. His real purpose, however, was transparent to everyone when he asked to speak privately with Jeremiah. "He wants Father's permission to court you," Maja whispered excitedly to Ingrid as the men disappeared into Jeremiah's study. Ingrid affected nonchalance, though her flushed cheeks betrayed her feelings. "Perhaps. We shall see." The conversation in the study was brief but meaningful. Thomas presented himself with straightforward dignity, outlining his intentions and his plans for the future, his savings for university, his ambitions in medicine and historical research, his deep respect and growing affection for Ingrid. Jeremiah listened carefully, then asked only one question. "And what of the extraordinary events you witnessed in this house? How do they fit into your rational scientific worldview?" Thomas considered this thoughtfully. "I've come to believe, sir, that there are more aspects to our existence than science has yet categorized. I don't reject what I experienced. I simply recognize it as evidence that our understanding is still incomplete." This answer seemed to satisfy Jeremiah, who gave his blessing for Thomas to pay formal calls on Ingrid, with the understanding that any engagement would be contingent on her acceptance to the women's college she hoped to attend. Winter in Miller's Creek brought a new rhythm to life, quieter days, longer evenings spent in family conversation or reading by lamplight. The community gathered more frequently for social events, sharing music and stories to brighten the shorter days. At one such gathering in early December, Benjamin Walsh, the freight driver who had delivered the portrait, returned to Miller's Creek with a shipment of Christmas goods. When he encountered the Lindholms at the town hall social, he was visibly surprised by the change in them. "You all look lighter somehow," he observed, accepting a cup of cider from Elsa, "especially the girls. Must be something in that Texas air agreeing with you European folks after all." Jeremiah exchanged a knowing glance with his wife. "We've settled in properly now," he said simply. "Found our place here." Benjamin nodded, then lowered his voice. "That portrait I brought, you peculiar thing. Never did shake the feeling it was ... unusual. Everything work out all right with it?" "The portrait served its purpose," Jeremiah replied cryptically. "It's where it belongs now." Benjamin seemed about to ask for clarification when the musicians struck up a lively tune. Thomas appeared at Ingrid's side, offering his hand for the dance. As they moved away, Benjamin watched them thoughtfully. "Young Reed seems taken with your daughter," he observed. "Yes," Jeremiah agreed. "They share certain experiences that have created a unique bond." Benjamin didn't press for details. In frontier communities like Miller's Creek, people learned to respect the private affairs of their neighbors. Whatever had transpired with the Lindholms, whatever shadow had briefly touched their lives, was clearly resolved now. As the winter deepened and Christmas approached, Ingrid received word of her acceptance to Mount Holyoke Female Seminary for the following autumn. The letter arrived on the same day that snow fell on Miller's Creek for the first time in years, a rare occurrence that the settlers took as a fortuitous omen. That evening, as the family gathered in the parlor where once the portrait had hung, Jeremiah raised a toast to his daughter's future. "To new beginnings," he said, "built on honest reckonings with the past." Elsa smiled at her husband, caught it at her husband, and to the Lindstad sisters, "May they rest in peace." Outside the window in the unusual Texas snow, two sets of footprints appeared briefly on the pristine white surface, small, feminine tracks that circled the house once and then vanished at the garden's edge, leaving no trail to follow. Inside, only Maja noticed, watching wide-eyed from the window. But there was no fear in her expression, only a small, understanding smile as she whispered, "Goodbye," to the winter darkness. Spring 1848 brought renewal to Miller's Creek. The Lindholm ranch flourished, with new calves strengthening the herd and fresh growth covering the winter-brown pastures. The settlement itself was expanding, with 3 new families arriving from the east, drawn by stories of opportunity in the Texas territory. Life had assumed a pleasant rhythm for the Lindholms. Jeremiah had established the promised charitable foundation, with the first disbursements already helping orphan children in both Galveston and Uppsala. Elsa had fully recovered her health and had become a central figure in the community, hosting gatherings that brought together the diverse settlers of Miller's Creek. Maya, now 16, had blossomed in the aftermath of their ordeal, showing a surprising talent for art that Reverend Cooper's wife was helping her develop. Her sketches of Texas landscapes were accomplished enough that the general store had begun displaying them for sale to travelers. And Ingrid, in the final months before her departure for Mount Holyoke, divided her time between helping at Dr. Harrison's office and long walks with Thomas Reed, during which they discussed everything from medical advancements to historical mysteries to their shared plans for the future. On one such walk in late April, they found themselves near the old well, a place they had generally avoided since the discovery of the Lindholm Sisters' remains. "It looks so ordinary now," Ingrid observed, stopping at a respectful distance from the stone circle, which had been permanently sealed with a concrete cap after the sheriff's investigation concluded. Thomas nodded. Nature has a way of reclaiming sites of disturbance. Given enough time, even the most traumatic events fade into the landscape. Ingrid considered this. Not fade, perhaps, but integrate, become part of the larger story. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, both reflecting on the extraordinary events they had witnessed and the bond those experiences had forged between them. "I've been meaning to show you something," Thomas said finally, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small leather-bound book. "I found this among Dr. Harrison's collection of medical texts. It's a Swedish treatise on folk remedies from the mid-1700s. Ingrid took the book curiously. "What made you notice it?" "The author's name." Thomas pointed to the faded lettering on the spine. Erickson." Ingrid's fingers went still on the leather binding. "The painter?" Thomas nodded. "I believe so. According to the introduction, he was known both for his portraiture and his interest in alternative medicine. The book contains conventional herbal remedies, but also sections on more esoteric practices." "Binding rituals," Ingrid murmured, remembering the confession written on the back of the portrait. "Exactly. It seems Erickson was what we might call a cunning man, part artist, part healer, part something else." Thomas hesitated, then continued more carefully. "There's a specific section on what he terms capturing the essence. It describes techniques for incorporating bodily substances, hair, nail clippings, blood into paintings to create a perfect likeness. A perfect prison, he means," Ingrid said with a shudder. Thomas touched her arm gently. "I thought you should know. Understanding what happened fully might help prevent similar occurrences in the future." Ingrid appreciated his sentiment, but something about his phrasing caught her attention. "Similar occurrences? You think this wasn't unique?" "I've been corresponding with a historian at Harvard who specializes in American folk traditions," Thomas explained. "When I described the general circumstances without revealing your family's personal involvement, he mentioned several cases of portraits associated with unusual phenomena. Most were dismissed as superstition, but double quotes, but now you wonder," Ingrid finished for him. "I wonder about many things now," Thomas admitted. "The experience has opened my mind to possibilities I previously would have rejected outright. That's why I've decided to add folklore studies to my medical curriculum when I begin at university next year." They resumed walking, turning back toward the settlement. The spring sun warmed their shoulders, and meadowlarks called from the surrounding grasslands, a perfect Texas afternoon that seemed worlds away from the supernatural terror they had confronted. "Will you write to me from Mount Holyoke?" Thomas asked, changing the subject to brighter matters. "Of course," Ingrid replied with a smile, "though I expect our letters will cross in transit, as you'll be writing to me from Harvard at the same time. Then we'll have twice the correspondence to look forward to," Thomas said, his expression warming. As they approached the Lindholm house, they noticed a wagon outside. Benjamin Walsh had returned on another freight run from Galveston. "Miss Ingrid." "Mr. Reed," the driver called when he spotted them. "It's just the people I was hoping to see." Benjamin was unloading a small wooden crate from his wagon. "This came all the way from Sweden," he explained. "Addressed to the Lindholm family, care of Thomas Reed." Thomas looked surprised. "For me? Who would?" "The Uppsala Historical Society," Ingrid read from the shipping label. "Father must have told them about your assistance with the family matter." They brought the crate inside, where Jeremiah and Elsa joined them in the parlor to see what had been sent. Thomas carefully pried open the lid, revealing protective straw packing around a smaller box of polished wood. Inside this second container, nestled in velvet, lay a daguerreotype, one of the new photographic images that were just beginning to replace painted portraits among the wealthy. The image showed the churchyard in Uppsala where the Lindholm sisters had been reburied, with their new headstone clearly visible. "How thoughtful," Elsa remarked. "A remembrance of the proper resting place." But as Ingrid lifted the daguerreotype for a closer look, she noticed something that made her breath catch. At the edge of the image, barely visible beside the church door, stood two indistinct female figures, transparent enough that the stonework behind them showed through their forms, but unmistakably there. Thomas saw them too, his eyes widening slightly. Neither of them pointed out the figures to Ingrid's parents. Some things, they had tacitly agreed, were better kept between those who would understand. Beneath the daguerreotype lay a letter written in formal English, thanking Jeremiah for his generosity in establishing the charitable foundation and for returning the remains of the Lindholm sisters to their homeland. It also specifically acknowledged Thomas Reed's scholarly assistance in translating documents and uncovering historical truths. "They've invited you to visit the Historical Society's archives should you ever travel to Sweden," Jeremiah noted, reading over Thomas's shoulder. "Perhaps one day," Thomas replied. "There's much to learn from how different cultures preserve their histories and their secrets." The final item in the box was smaller, a flat package wrapped in silk. When Thomas unwrapped it, he revealed a miniature version of the portrait, showing the Lindholm sisters as they appeared in its final form, peaceful, at rest in the Uppsala churchyard. The locket that Ingrid had placed on the original painting was reproduced in exquisite detail, connecting the sisters as it had in the larger work. "A gift for you both," Jeremiah explained, "commissioned by Elsa and me before we left Sweden. A reminder not of the tragedy but of its resolution, of justice finally served and peace restored." As Ingrid and Thomas studied the miniature portrait, the afternoon sun caught its surface, making the painted image seem to glow with inner light. For the briefest moment, so brief they might almost have imagined it, the painted sisters seemed to smile directly at them, acknowledging the role they had played in setting things right. That evening, as the Lindholms and Thomas shared dinner, Benjamin Walsh entertained them with news from Galveston and beyond. The world was changing rapidly. Gold had been discovered in California, triggering a rush of migration westward. New technologies were transforming communication and transportation. The daguerreotype that had arrived that day was just one example of how images could now be captured without an artist's brush. "Makes you wonder," Benjamin mused, "if these new photograph contraptions might put portrait painters out of business entirely." "Perhaps that would be for the best," Ingrid said quietly. "Some arts are better left in the past." Later, as the stars emerged above Miller's Creek, Thomas and Ingrid stood on the porch, reluctant to end the day despite the growing evening chill. "What will you do with Ericsson's book?" Ingrid asked. Thomas considered the question carefully. "Study it, I think. Not to replicate his methods, but to understand them. Knowledge itself isn't dangerous, only its application can be harmful or beneficial." Ingrid nodded. "My father believes that bringing the truth to light is always the right course, no matter how painful. That secrets fester in darkness but lose their power when exposed to the sun." "A wise perspective," Thomas agreed, "and one I hope to follow in my own studies." As Thomas prepared to leave, they both glanced up at the night sky, where a shooting star traced a brilliant path across the heavens. "A good omen," Ingrid said with a smile. "For new beginnings," Thomas replied, gently taking her hand in his. Neither of them noticed the two faint, luminous figures standing at the edge of the property, women in 18th century dress, watching with benevolent expressions before fading into the starlit Texas night. Their long journey finally complete, their story preserved, their rest eternal. In the Lindholm home, where once fear and supernatural dread had reigned, now only peace remained, the peace that comes from confronting the darkest chapters of the past and ensuring that justice, though long delayed, is finally served.